Senator Schiff, you didn't just sell a narrative. You sold the country a certainty you never proved, and you charged the public's trust as the fee. That line hit like a cold slap, because it wasn't profanity or spectacle. It was a direct accusation of something Washington fears more than scandal, which is intentional misdirection with institutional authority. And the reason it makes people sit up is that it doesn't argue about ideology. It argues about standards, about whether power can claim evidence it cannot actually show. Some of you are already asking why the attack comes so sharp. Why say it that hard? And why now, instead of hiding behind polite committee language like everyone else? Stay to the end of this video, because the answer is not personal drama. It's the mechanism of how modern politics manufactures legitimacy and punishes anyone who tries to audit it. Last Tuesday in Washington looked like one more oversight hearing that would dissolve into routine and talking points, except this one carried a fuse from the moment the date was announced. A Senate Intelligence Committee room usually feels like a vault where language is careful and nobody wants to accidentally say the quiet part out loud. Yet the crowd showed up as if this were a televised prize fight. The cameras were stacked where the sight lines are clean. The staffers were unusually tense, and the press row had that barely disguised hunger that only appears when a story can be cut into viral clips. The official purpose sounded boring enough: intelligence oversight, chain of command clarity, procedural accountability. But the real purpose was obvious to anyone who has watched the town long enough. This was Adam Schiff trying to interrogate Tulsi Gabbard in public, and Tulsi Gabbard showing up with the kind of composure that suggests she did not come to explain herself. If you've followed American politics for the last few years, you already understand why those two names in the same sentence trigger two different kinds of loyalty. Schiff built a brand on certainty, on the posture of a man who speaks as if he is always holding something the audience cannot see. A kind of moral escrow account, backed by classified briefings. Gabbard's brand is different because it leans on service, on the credibility of someone who has been inside the machinery of war and came out distrustful of people who use that machinery for theater. My personal view, and I'll put it right here early so you know what lens I'm using, is that Washington's most dangerous habit is not corruption in the cheap sense, but narrative leverage disguised as national security. When elected officials imply they possess proof while refusing to meet the burden of proof, they aren't just persuading, they're training the public to accept authority as evidence, and that habit decays a republic. Schiff understood television better than most of his colleagues, which is why he assumed he could control the hearing's emotional temperature with tone alone. He opened with the kind of question that sounds reasonable to casual viewers, but functions as a character frame, a way to mark someone as suspect before they even answer. He referenced past controversy, foreign leaders, a familiar insinuation that travels well on cable news, because insinuation is lighter than evidence and therefore easier to carry into prime time. And on a normal day, with a normal witness, that strategy works, because witnesses are trained to be deferential, to answer within the boundaries the senator sets, to accept the premise even while disputing details. But what made this day different was that Gabbard did not accept the premise. And she didn't even seem interested in winning the room the way politicians usually do. She arrived on schedule, not with showmanship, but with that deliberate stillness you recognize from people who have been trained to stay calm under stress. She wore the uniform of modern seriousness, the dark suit, the restrained presentation, the absence of sparkle. Not because sparkle is wrong, but because she wasn't feeding the algorithm. She sat alone, no visible swarm of advisors whispering lines into her ear and the room noticed because loneliness at the witness table is either weakness or confidence. Schiff's opening questions moved the way his questions always move, toward a suggestion of compromised judgment. And the cameras leaned in because everybody wants a moment of confrontation. And then Gabbard did the one thing hearings are not designed for, which is to treat the questioner's posture as part of the subject matter. At a certain point, a hearing stops being about what is asked and becomes about who has the right to ask it, which is why the audience can feel the turn before it is spoken. Gabbard responded politely at first, not dodging, not panicking. And that calm matters because it prevents the senator from claiming dominance through emotional contrast. Then she shifted, and the shift was subtle enough that half the room didn't realize it until the gravity changed, like when a plane banks and your stomach knows before your eyes do. She signaled that she would answer the questions, but she would not perform. And in that single refusal, she challenged the hidden assumption that the microphone belongs only to the committee dais. That is when the room became dangerous for Schiff, because once the witness refuses the performance contract, the senator must either return to evidence or reveal that he was never there to collect it. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, and this is why I'm insisting you watch it to the end, because the discomfort is the whole point. A democracy can survive harsh debate. It can survive anger, and it can even survive hypocrisy. But it struggles when power treats insinuation as proof and treats correction as disloyalty. The modern audience is trained to confuse intensity with truth, and the modern politician is trained to exploit that confusion because it is cheaper than persuasion. So the real question is not whether Schiff can land a headline or whether Gabbard can produce a viral clip, because both can, and both know it. The question is whether, when confronted with the burden of evidence, the system collapses into theater or climbs back into standards. And that is what this confrontation forces into the open. The committee chair finished the ritual opening lines, the kind that sound solemn on paper, but feel like elevator music, when everyone knows the real event is the clash. Schiff leaned in with that practiced softness that pretends to invite conversation while quietly setting a trap, because he understands that viewers remember tone before they remember substance. He framed the first sequence around foreign travel and alleged talking points, because the fastest way to discredit a person in Washington is to imply they are repeating someone else's script. He did not say, "Prove your claims." He said, "Explain yourself." And that difference matters, because explanation is an endless hallway where the questioner controls the exits. Gabbard listened without flinching, and the calm was not passivity. It was the kind of stillness that signals a person has already decided what the argument is actually about. Schiff's strategy was to force a binary, because binaries are clean on television and messy in reality. And messy reality is where oversight hearings usually go to die. He tried to compress years of disputes into a yes or no frame, because a clipped answer becomes a headline, and a headline becomes a weapon, especially when it can be replayed without context. He asked as if the audience was the jury and he was the prosecutor, and the unspoken assumption was that the witness must earn innocence rather than the senator earning guilt. That posture works when the witness is a bureaucrat with no independent brand. But it becomes risky when the witness can match the senator's confidence without matching his theatricality. And the moment Schiff assumed the room belonged to him, Tulsi Gabbard did something that felt almost impolite in Washington, which is to demand the same standards in return. She answered the early questions with restraint, but you could hear the shift when she stopped chasing his framing and started naming the technique he was using. In plain English, she treated the hearing like an audit rather than a performance. And audits are dangerous because they move the burden of proof back where it belongs. Then she did the thing senators hate most, which is to pull the camera's attention away from the accusation and toward the accuser's credibility. If you want to understand power, watch what happens when someone interrupts the flow of implication with a request for receipts, because the entire building is built on implication. Gabbard's posture said, without shouting, that Schiff could keep rolling out insinuations, but she would keep returning to what was known, what was documented, and what was provable. Here is the controversial question that hangs over the whole room, and it's worth asking, because nobody in polite circles wants to ask it out loud. If a senator hints that he possesses proof the public cannot see, how is the public supposed to distinguish legitimate secrecy from convenient storytelling that cannot be challenged? And if the public cannot challenge it, what stops any politician from turning classified into a magic word that substitutes for evidence whenever the evidence is thin? This is not a partisan question because the temptation is universal, and the only difference between parties is who benefits on a given day. The point is that once you normalize authority as evidence, you train the audience to stop thinking like citizens and start thinking like fans defending a brand. Schiff kept pressing because he could sense the narrative slipping. And when narrative slips, politicians often accelerate instead of clarifying, like drivers who speed up on ice. He tried to re-anchor the exchange in moral language because moral language makes dissent sound sinister, and sinister is easier to punish than disagreement. He implied that skepticism about certain interventions sounded like sympathy for adversaries, which is a rhetorical move as old as empire, just dressed in modern television lighting. Gabbard let him finish, and then, with a dry calm that sounded almost amused, she treated his insinuation like a claim that required sourcing rather than applause. That is when the room's energy changed from partisan excitement to something closer to professional anxiety, because everyone recognized the direction she was steering. When she asked to address the record, Schiff's expression tightened in a way that cameras love, because it looks like indignation even when it is calculation. He tried to remind her of procedure, which is Washington's polite way of saying, "Stay in your assigned role," and it is always invoked when someone threatens hierarchy. Gabbard acknowledged procedure, then used the record itself as the procedure, which is a subtle but powerful reversal, because now the institution becomes the standard rather than the senator. She signaled that if Schiff wanted to question judgment, then judgment would be measured by what was said, what was sworn to, and what was later proven true or false. At that point, the hearing stopped being about her travel or her tone and started becoming about Schiff's relationship with certainty, which is his most fragile asset. And yes, there was a moment of humor, the kind that makes the room laugh because it exposes the absurdity without turning cruel. Gabbard referred to the cable news phase of government, not as an insult, but as a diagnosis. And you could feel staffers win because they knew the phrase would travel. A few people in the back laughed the way people laugh when someone says what they have been thinking, especially when they have been pretending not to think it. Schiff smiled briefly, the tight smile of someone who knows a line scored, because Washington humor is often just a scalpel in a velvet glove. But humor is not harmless in a hearing because it can puncture the aura of control. And once control is punctured, the audience starts watching for truth instead of vibe. Schiff attempted to regroup by demanding definitions, because definitions can be used like fences, and fences can keep an argument from reaching the uncomfortable field beyond. He pushed for absolutes, trying to force Gabbard into statements that could later be clipped into a narrative of irresponsibility or disloyalty. She refused the trap by refusing the false choice, and she did it in a way that made his insistence look less like oversight and more like a search for a gotcha. In a sentence that sounded simple but carried a lot of institutional weight, she said the job of intelligence is to reduce uncertainty, not to manufacture certainty for political convenience. If you're looking for the real philosophical clash, it's right there, because Schiff's brand thrives on moral certainty, while Gabbard's stance demands evidentiary humility. Then she turned carefully toward the timeline that haunted the room, because everyone there knew why the public cared about this matchup in the first place. She referenced how narratives are born, how they get repeated, how they become common knowledge, and how, once embedded, they become almost impossible to extract. She did not call Schiff a criminal, and she did not claim a grand conspiracy, because that would be the same sin in reverse, and she clearly wanted the contrast. Instead, she asked questions that forced him to either narrow his claims into defensible facts or admit that his past certainty had been rhetorical rather than evidentiary. And the reason that matters is that a politician can survive being disliked. But it is much harder to survive being revealed as someone who cannot separate inference from proof. By now, the staffers were moving differently, whispering faster, passing notes more urgently, because hearings have their own body language when control is slipping. Reporters were typing in that frantic rhythm you only hear when the clip is already writing itself. And senators were watching the cameras as much as they were watching the witness. Schiff tried to reclaim momentum with a measured rebuke, the kind that sounds statesmanlike but functions as a warning, because he wanted her back under his framing. Gabbard responded with what sounded like polite refusal, but what it really was a statement that she would not launder insinuation into legitimacy by treating it as a given. And at that moment, the central question became unavoidable. When powerful people confuse certainty with proof, who pays the price? And why is the price always social trust? If you want a second controversial question, consider this one, because it is uncomfortable precisely because it sounds plausible on both sides. Is Washington's Russia-era rhetoric proof of principled vigilance, or was it, at least in part, a career engine that rewarded dramatic certainty more than disciplined accuracy? And if it was partly a career engine, does the system ever punish the overreach? Or does it simply promote the most confident narrators until the public stops believing anyone? This is why the exchange matters beyond personalities, because it is about incentives, and incentives shape behavior more reliably than anyone's stated values. When a hearing exposes incentives on camera, it becomes bigger than Schiff versus Gabbard, because it forces the audience to see the machinery behind the performance. The chair tried to move the schedule along, but the schedule was already dead. Because moments like this do not obey agendas written by staff. Schiff's remaining questions began to sound like he was reading to regain footing. And there is nothing wrong with notes, except that notes cannot improvise when the room changes. Gabbard's answers, by contrast, sounded like she was building a structure, step by step, guiding the audience toward a standard rather than a slogan. She kept returning to the idea that public claims must eventually be reconciled with what the record shows, because otherwise, oversight becomes just another word for narrative warfare. And that is the point where Schiff realized, even if only for a second, that this was not the kind of hearing where he could win by landing one sharp line for cable. If you want to understand why this became combustible, it is because Adam Schiff's power has always relied on the audience's assumption that he speaks from hidden proof. If Tulsi Gabbard can credibly suggest that the hidden proof did not match the public certainty, then she is not just challenging him. She is challenging the model that made him. That is why the room felt less like a committee, and more like a stage where the script suddenly got rewritten mid-performance. The most revealing detail was not a raised voice or an insult, but the way Schiff started insisting on procedure, while Gabbard insisted on standards. Because that difference is everything. When procedure becomes a shield against standards, it stops being democracy's safeguard and starts becoming bureaucracy's camouflage, and audiences can sense that even without knowing the jargon. The third stretch of the hearing unfolded in a way that seasoned staffers recognize instantly. The moment when everyone understands that the exchange is no longer about extracting information, but about defining reality for the audience watching at home. Schiff adjusted his posture and leaned back slightly, a physical reset meant to signal authority, because when facts feel unstable, posture becomes a substitute for certainty. He began speaking more slowly, choosing words that sounded procedural and sober, as if cadence alone could reassert control over a room that had started drifting away from him. Gabbard watched him with the patience of someone who has waited through worse than a hostile hearing. And that patience mattered, because impatience is the easiest way to make a confident argument look defensive. What followed was not loud, not explosive, but far more damaging, because it forced Schiff to confront the gap between how power is exercised and how truth is verified. Schiff tried to reclaim the narrative by invoking institutional complexity, a familiar move that implies ordinary viewers simply cannot grasp the nuances involved. He spoke about threat environments, intelligence gaps, and evolving assessments, layering abstraction upon abstraction until the original claim began to blur into background noise. That strategy works when the witness plays along and nods, but Gabbard did something more dangerous, which was to translate his abstractions back into plain language. She reminded the room that intelligence assessments are probabilistic by design, not moral verdicts, and that treating them as courtroom proof is how errors metastasize. In one sentence, delivered evenly and without drama, she said that uncertainty is not weakness in intelligence, but pretending certainty where it does not exist is. This is where Schiff's discomfort became visible, not in outrage, but in repetition. Because repetition is often a sign that someone is trying to convince themselves as much as the audience. He circled back to the idea of patterns, because patterns sound persuasive even when causation is thin, and viewers are conditioned to accept patterns as proof. Gabbard acknowledged patterns, then asked the question that patterns always fear, which is whether alternative explanations had been systematically excluded. That question hung in the air longer than most questions do in Washington, because it requires admitting that a conclusion might have been premature. And premature conclusions are dangerous not because they are wrong, but because they harden into narratives that resist correction. Here is another uncomfortable question that many in that room were thinking, but would never phrase so bluntly. At what point does warning the public cross the line into shaping the public, especially when the warning carries the authority of classified access? And who decides when that line has been crossed? The politician making the claim, or the evidence that eventually contradicts it? These questions are unsettling because they expose how fragile trust really is, and how easily it can be leveraged for influence rather than understanding. Gabbard's line of questioning was quietly pulling those questions into the open without turning them into accusations, which made them harder to dismiss. Schiff attempted to pivot again, this time framing the exchange as an attack on institutions rather than an audit of conduct. He warned that excessive skepticism could undermine faith in intelligence agencies, a point that sounds noble until you realize it reverses accountability. Gabbard responded by distinguishing between respecting institutions and protecting individuals who misuse institutional credibility, and the distinction mattered deeply. She argued that blind faith erodes trust faster than transparency, because people eventually discover contradictions on their own. When leaders acknowledge limits openly, trust bends, but when leaders insist on certainty and are later contradicted, trust snaps. The room felt different now, less theatrical, more introspective, because the exchange had moved away from partisan identity and into civic responsibility. Even senators who clearly disagreed with Gabbard ideologically appeared attentive, because the framework she was building did not require agreement, only honesty. Schiff's questions began to feel reactive, as if he were responding to her architecture rather than constructing his own. He asked whether she was suggesting bad faith, and she answered carefully, saying that she was suggesting consequences, not motives. That distinction was crucial, because consequences can be evaluated empirically, while motives are endless rabbit holes that never resolve. There was a brief moment of levity that cut through the tension, when Gabbard remarked that intelligence failures often look obvious in hindsight, especially to people paid to comment after the fact. A few chuckles rippled through the room, not because it was cutting, but because it was true. And truth delivered lightly can disarm more effectively than anger. Schiff smiled thinly, aware that the line would circulate online, stripped of context, exactly the way so many of his own lines once had. That symmetry was not lost on anyone paying attention, and you could feel the irony settling over the room. Humor, in that moment, was not mockery, but exposure, revealing how media incentives reward confidence over correction. As the exchange continued, Gabbard brought the conversation back to responsibility, not as a moral lecture, but as a professional obligation. She emphasized that intelligence leaders must resist pressure to provide political comfort, even when elected officials demand clarity that the data cannot support. Schiff bristled at the implication because it inverted the usual hierarchy, placing evidence above narrative rather than narrative above evidence. He responded by asserting that leadership sometimes requires strong statements to mobilize vigilance, a claim that resonated emotionally but wobbled analytically. Gabbard countered that vigilance fueled by exaggeration eventually collapses under its own weight, leaving cynicism where concern once lived. This is the point where viewers at home likely started asking themselves why this exchange felt different from the usual partisan theater. It felt different because it was not about who was right in 2016 or who benefited politically, but about how certainty is manufactured and sold. Gabbard was not asking the audience to trust her over Schiff. She was asking them to trust processes that can be checked and challenged. Schiff, by contrast, was implicitly asking them to trust his judgment because of his role, a request that grows weaker each time evidence complicates the story. That contrast explains why the hearing clips spread so quickly, because people recognized a dynamic they had felt for years, but could not articulate. Another controversial question surfaced implicitly as the exchange unfolded, one that cuts across party lines. If intelligence assessments had gone the other way, would the same voices have urged caution and nuance, or would certainty have been equally marketable? And if certainty is always rewarded when it aligns with audience preference, how can institutions ever correct themselves without external pressure? These are not accusations, they are structural questions, and structures matter more than personalities. By forcing these questions into the open, Gabbard was reframing the hearing from a partisan contest into a case study of incentive failure. Schiff's final attempt in this segment was to appeal to legacy, to his years of service and his stated commitment to democratic norms. Legacy is a powerful shield in Washington because it reframes criticism as ingratitude rather than evaluation. Gabbard acknowledged his service, then separated service from infallibility, a move that disarms defensiveness while preserving accountability. She said that institutions survive not because leaders are perfect, but because they are willing to revisit claims when evidence changes. That sentence landed heavily, because it implied that the real failure was not the original suspicion, but the refusal to recalibrate publicly when certainty evaporated. By the end of this portion of the hearing, It was clear that the balance of power in the room had shifted in a subtle but irreversible way. Schiff still had the microphone, still had the title, but he no longer had narrative dominance. And narrative dominance is what hearings are really about. Gabbard had succeeded in moving the discussion from accusation to accountability, from insinuation to standard, without raising her voice or breaking decorum. The audience could feel that something consequential was building, not a single viral moment, but a cumulative case that demanded resolution. And that resolution was coming, because the next phase would force Schiff into a direct confrontation with his own past certainty. A confrontation he could no longer sidestep with abstraction. By the time the hearing slid into its fourth phase, the tension in the room had changed character. No longer sharp and electric, but heavy, like a pressure system that refuses to move on. Everyone understood that the earlier exchanges had cracked something open. And once a crack appears in a political narrative, gravity does the rest of the work. Schiff sensed it too, which is why his next move was not to escalate, but to moralize. Because when factual ground weakens, moral language often becomes the last refuge. He began speaking about responsibility to democracy, about the danger of undermining public confidence, and about how reckless skepticism could be weaponized by bad actors. The words were familiar, well-rehearsed, and emotionally resonant, but they floated above the specific questions that had already been placed on the table. Gabbard listened without interruption, letting him finish, because interruption would have allowed him to frame her as dismissive rather than precise. When she responded, she did not challenge his commitment to democracy, which would have turned the exchange into a loyalty contest, but instead questioned the method by which democratic trust is maintained. She argued that trust does not come from certainty delivered loudly, but from restraint exercised consistently, especially when the stakes are high and the incentives to exaggerate are strongest. Her tone was steady, almost instructional, as if she were explaining a principle rather than prosecuting a case. That approach unsettled Schiff more than accusation would have, because it positioned her not as an opponent, but as an auditor. This was the moment where the hearing crossed an invisible line, shifting from performance to reckoning. Schiff tried to assert that intelligence work often requires drawing conclusions before all information is available, a claim that is technically true, but contextually incomplete. Gabbard agreed with the premise, then separated drawing conclusions internally from broadcasting certainty externally, and that distinction mattered more than it first appeared. Internal assessments evolve quietly, but public declarations harden expectations, and when those expectations collapse, they leave behind distrust that cannot be classified away. She pointed out that the intelligence community is trained to express confidence levels, not verdicts, and that political actors often erase those confidence levels for rhetorical effect. A few people in the room smiled nervously at that because they recognized themselves in the description. Schiff attempted to reframe her argument as Monday morning quarterbacking, suggesting that hindsight was being unfairly applied to decisions made under pressure. Gabbard countered that hindsight only becomes relevant when present-day claims refuse to acknowledge past error, turning learning into denial. She reminded the committee that she was not revisiting the initial investigation, but the prolonged insistence on certainty long after contrary evidence had emerged. That clarification closed an escape hatch Schiff had been reaching for, and you could see him recalibrate in real time. At this point, the questions in the room were no longer just about one senator's statements, but about the culture that rewarded them. Why is certainty so politically profitable even when accuracy is uncertain? And why does caution so often get framed as weakness? Why do media incentives favor bold claims over careful corrections, even though corrections are the backbone of credible analysis? And perhaps most uncomfortably, who benefits when ambiguity is smoothed into confidence for mass consumption? These questions hovered over the hearing like a second invisible audience shaping how every answer landed. Schiff leaned forward again, adopting a more personal tone, speaking about his years of service and the burdens of leadership. He suggested that leaders sometimes have to speak forcefully to mobilize action, even at the risk of oversimplification. Gabbard did not dispute the burden of leadership, but she challenged the assumption that forcefulness requires overstating conclusions. She noted that leaders also have a responsibility to model intellectual humility, especially when they possess asymmetric access to information. Without that humility, she argued, authority turns brittle, and brittle authority shatters when challenged. There was a brief, almost absurd moment when Schiff referenced public confusion as evidence of the need for strong messaging, prompting a soft ripple of laughter. Gabbard smiled slightly, then remarked that confusion is often the result of conflicting certainties rather than insufficient messaging. The humor was understated, but it cut deep because it exposed the paradox of modern political communication. The more confidently competing narratives are delivered, the less confident the public becomes in any of them. In that sense, certainty is not always clarifying. Sometimes it is corrosive. As the exchange continued, Gabbard returned to process, not personalities, emphasizing that accountability mechanisms only work if leaders submit themselves to them. She pointed out that classified access is a privilege, not a shield, and that invoking classification to imply certainty carries an ethical obligation to correct the record when certainty dissolves. Schiff bristled at that framing because it inverted the usual hierarchy, placing obligation on the speaker rather than deference on the audience. He responded by warning against politicizing intelligence, a phrase that landed awkwardly given the context. Gabbard replied calmly that politicization is not defined by who asks questions, but by whether answers are adjusted to fit a desired outcome. This was the moment where several senators shifted in their seats, because the implication was no longer abstract. If politicization is outcome-driven rather than party-driven, then anyone can be guilty of it, regardless of affiliation. That idea is deeply destabilizing in a system built on partisan alignment, because it dissolves the comfort of moral camps. Schiff's responses grew shorter, more guarded, as if he were conserving energy rather than advancing argument. Gabbard, by contrast, seemed to gain clarity, each answer building logically on the last. A controversial question surfaced implicitly, one that viewers would later argue about online. Is it more damaging to be wrong loudly or to be uncertain quietly? And which does democracy actually tolerate better? Another question followed close behind, even harder to answer. If leaders are never penalized for refusing to admit error, what incentive exists to ever recalibrate publicly? These questions did not require answers in the room to resonate, because they followed viewers home. Near the end of this segment, Schiff attempted to close ranks around the idea of institutional unity, suggesting that internal disagreements should not be aired publicly. Gabbard responded that unity without accountability is simply coordinated silence, and silence is not neutral when it preserves false impressions. She emphasized that transparency is not an attack on institutions, but a maintenance function, like stress testing a bridge before it collapses. The metaphor landed cleanly, because everyone understands that bridges do not fail because they are tested. They fail because they are ignored. Schiff had no immediate rebuttal to that, and the pause that followed spoke louder than any statement. By the time the chair signaled the transition to the next round, the room felt altered, as if the hearing had passed a point of no return. This This was no longer a matter of sparring over interpretations, but a confrontation with the costs of certainty unmoored from evidence. Schiff still occupied his seat, still held his title, but the authority that comes from narrative control had visibly eroded. Gabbard had not accused him of malice, but she had framed his conduct within a system that rewards overstatement and punishes correction. And in doing so, she set the stage for the next phase, where the abstract would give way to the irrevocably personal, and where the consequences of those incentives would finally be named. As the hearing moved deeper into its later hours, something subtle but decisive happened, because the room stopped thinking in terms of winners and losers and started thinking in terms of cost. Not political cost, measured in polls or headlines, but human cost, the kind that accumulates quietly while institutions congratulate themselves for holding the line. Schiff had spent much of his career speaking in the language of consequences, warning that democracy itself was at stake. Yet now that language circled back on him in an unexpected way. The question was no longer whether his intentions had been pure, but whether his certainty had been worth what followed from it. That shift mattered, because intentions are endlessly debatable, while outcomes are stubbornly real. Gabbard leaned into that distinction with deliberate care, choosing examples that were not theatrical, but illustrative, almost mundane in their specificity. She spoke about analysts whose reputations were damaged because their cautious assessments were overshadowed by louder narratives, and about professionals who learned that nuance was a career liability. She described how intelligence briefings, once designed to inform decision-makers, began to feel like props in a broader performance ecosystem. Her point was not that intelligence failed, but that it was repurposed, and repurposing always leaves residue. When information is bent to serve certainty, it does not snap back cleanly afterward. Schiff responded by invoking the extraordinary nature of the moment they had lived through, arguing that extraordinary times demand extraordinary clarity. It was a line that had once resonated strongly, and you could tell he expected it to land again. Gabbard did not dispute that the period was extraordinary, but she challenged the assumption that extraordinary clarity must come from extraordinary claims. She suggested instead that extraordinary times demand extraordinary discipline, especially from those entrusted with partial truths. That reframing stripped the drama out of the argument and replaced it with responsibility, which is far less forgiving. At this stage, a kind of quiet irony began to surface, one that even some observers in the room could not help but notice. Schiff, who had built his public image around moral urgency, now sounded defensive when asked to account for how that urgency had been expressed. Gabbard, often caricatured as contrarian or aloof, was the one grounding her critique in process and restraint. The inversion was not lost on the audience, and a few muted smiles appeared at moments when the contrast became almost too clean. Politics, after all, has a sense of humor, and it often reveals it at the most inconvenient times. One of the more contentious moments came when Gabbard posed a question that she framed carefully but knew would ripple outward. If a leader sincerely believes something that later proves false, is the obligation to defend the belief or to correct the record? She did not demand an answer immediately, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for viewers to fill it themselves. Schiff eventually replied that leaders must balance correction with preventing exploitation by bad actors. Gabbard acknowledged the concern, then observed that avoiding exploitation cannot become a blanket justification for avoiding accountability. That observation hit harder than any accusation could have, because it named a pattern without assigning motive. It suggested that fear of being seen as wrong can quietly override commitment to being accurate. In that space, narrative maintenance replaces truth-seeking, and correction becomes indistinguishable from concession. Gabbard warned that when leaders internalize that logic, they begin to treat the public as a risk to be managed rather than a partner to be informed. Once that happens, trust erodes not through scandal, but through attrition. There was a moment of unintended levity when Schiff, attempting to emphasize the complexity of intelligence work, referenced the difficulty of explaining caveats to a distracted public. Gabbard smiled faintly and replied that underestimating the public's capacity for nuance might be the most bipartisan mistake in Washington. A few people laughed, not loudly, but with the release of tension that comes when someone says what many have been thinking. The humor worked because it was not cruel, only revealing. It reminded everyone that complexity is not the enemy of democracy. Condescension is. As the exchange continued, the focus shifted toward precedent, a topic that tends to drain energy in hearings, but here did the opposite. Gabbard asked what precedent is set when a leader maintains certainty long after the evidentiary ground has shifted. She argued that such behavior teaches future officials that reputational preservation outranks intellectual honesty. Schiff countered that constant recalibration risks appearing weak, a concession that revealed more than he likely intended. Gabbard replied that equating correction with weakness is precisely how institutions drift from credibility into dogma. By now, the hearing felt less like a confrontation and more like a stress test, not of personalities, but of norms. The unspoken issue was whether American political culture still has room for public error without public exile. If admitting mistake guarantees political annihilation, then denial becomes the rational strategy, regardless of its broader cost. Gabbard did not frame this as a personal failing, but as a systemic trap that ensnares even well-intentioned actors. That distinction allowed the critique to land without collapsing into vendetta. Schiff's answers grew increasingly abstract, filled with phrases about institutional integrity and democratic resilience. They were not wrong, but they hovered above the concrete examples Gabbard kept returning to. Viewers could feel the difference between language that protects an image and language that interrogates behavior. The gap between those modes of speech widened with each exchange, making the contrast unavoidable. It was in that gap that the hearing's emotional weight truly settled. Toward the end of this phase, Gabbard made a point that would later be replayed endlessly online, precisely because it was so restrained. She said that history rarely judges leaders by how forcefully they spoke, but by how accurately they described reality when it mattered most. She added that truth does not require volume, only courage, and courage is often quieter than outrage. Schiff listened, nodding slightly, though it was unclear whether in agreement or acknowledgement of the moment. Either way, the statement hung in the air long after she finished speaking. By the time the chair signaled another transition, the room felt changed again, but this time in a deeper way. The conversation had moved beyond the specifics of Russia, intelligence, or even one senator's conduct. It had become a referendum on how modern political incentives distort judgment, and on whether those distortions are reversible. Schiff still had defenses, still had allies, still had explanations, but the narrative advantage had slipped from his grasp. What remained was a question that no one in the room could avoid carrying forward: whether truth can survive in a system that punishes those who admit it too late. By the final stretch of the hearing, the atmosphere had settled into something that felt less like confrontation and more like aftermath, the quiet that follows a storm when everyone is assessing what remains standing. No one was interrupting anymore, not because the rules demanded restraint, but because the room had reached the point where interruption would have felt dishonest. Schiff sat with the posture of someone who understood that the argument was no longer moving in his direction, even if the formal structure still favored him. Gabbard, for her part, seemed almost relieved. as though the burden she had carried into the room had finally been placed on the table where it belonged. The cameras kept rolling, but the performance instinct had faded, replaced by something closer to record-making. What became clear in those last exchanges was that this was never really about winning the hearing itself. It was about forcing a reckoning with a style of politics that treats certainty as a weapon rather than a responsibility. Gabbard articulated that reckoning without grandstanding, emphasizing that intelligence work, by its nature, demands humility because it operates in probabilities, not absolutes. She warned that when political figures convert probability into certainty for public consumption, they create expectations that reality cannot sustain. When those expectations collapse, the damage does not land on politicians alone, but on institutions and citizens alike. Schiff made one final attempt to reclaim moral footing by arguing that his actions were motivated by a desire to protect democratic norms. Gabbard responded not by questioning that desire, but by asking whether the methods used had strengthened or weakened those norms over time. She pointed out that norms survive through consistent application, not selective enforcement based on perceived necessity. If democracy requires trust, and trust requires honesty about uncertainty, then overstating conclusions corrodes the very foundation it claims to defend. The logic was difficult to refute precisely because it avoided personal indictment. At this point, the hearing had crossed fully into a broader conversation about leadership accountability. Gabbard suggested that leaders are judged less by the crises they face and more by how they adjust when new information emerges. Adaptation, she argued, is not a sign of weakness, but of seriousness, a willingness to subordinate ego to accuracy. She contrasted that with the political culture of doubling down, where admitting error is framed as surrender rather than correction. That culture, she warned, incentivizes narrative maintenance over truth-seeking, with long-term consequences that no press strategy can erase. There was a moment of dry humor when she observed that politics has a peculiar allergy to the phrase, "I was wrong," even though every credible discipline relies on it. A few people in the room chuckled softly, recognizing the truth in the observation without needing it spelled out. The levity did not undercut the seriousness of her point, but sharpened it, because humor often exposes absurdity more effectively than anger. If science, medicine, and engineering can correct course publicly without collapsing, she asked, why is politics uniquely fragile? The question lingered without demanding an answer. As the chair prepared to close the session, Schiff offered a final statement, emphasizing unity and forward motion. It was a familiar cadence designed to signal closure without resolution, a way to move past discomfort without addressing its source. Gabbard acknowledged the sentiment, then added that moving forward requires clarity about what went wrong, not simply agreement to stop looking back. She stressed that accountability is not backward-looking punishment, but forward-looking prevention. Without it, the same incentives will reproduce the same behaviors under new names. The hearing ended without applause, without dramatic exits, and without the kind of theatrical punctuation that usually marks viral moments. Yet, it was precisely that lack of spectacle that made the exchange resonate beyond the room. Viewers watching later did not see a shouting match or a personal takedown, but a methodical dismantling of certainty unsupported by evidence. They saw a contrast between narrative confidence and evidentiary discipline, and the difference was unmistakable. In a media environment saturated with outrage, restraint became the most disruptive force in the room. In the days that followed, the conversation shifted in predictable but revealing ways. Supporters of Schiff focused on intentions, arguing that motives mattered more than outcomes and that urgency justified rhetorical excess. Supporters of Gabbard pointed to process, insisting that good intentions cannot excuse sustained misrepresentation. What mattered was not which side people chose, but which standard they implicitly endorsed. Were leaders to be judged by what they believed at the time, or by what they did when those beliefs proved incorrect? That question cut across party lines, unsettling comfortable alliances. It forced observers to consider how often they themselves had rewarded certainty over accuracy, confidence over caution. It raised the uncomfortable possibility that many political incentives are built not to discover truth, but to delay correction. Once that possibility is acknowledged, it becomes difficult to unsee. The hearing did not create that reality, but it illuminated it. For Gabbard, the moment solidified a role she had been moving toward for years, not as a partisan counterweight, but as a procedural critic. Her authority did not come from volume or alignment, but from access paired with restraint. She did not ask the public to trust her blindly, but to examine the record she placed in front of them. That approach resonated with viewers fatigued by perpetual certainty delivered without accountability. It offered an alternative model of leadership grounded in discipline rather than drama. For Schiff, the hearing marked a narrowing of rhetorical space. He could still speak, still appear, still argue, but the aura of unassailable moral authority had fractured. Once fractured, such authority is difficult to restore because it relies on perception more than position. Every future claim would now be measured against the questions he had declined to answer. In politics, silence in the wrong moment can echo longer than speech. The broader implication of the exchange extended beyond the two figures involved. It challenged the audience to reconsider what they reward in political discourse. Do they amplify the loudest voice or the most careful one? Do they prefer certainty even when it proves brittle, or complexity that withstands pressure? These preferences shape incentives long before leaders ever step into a hearing room. As analysts revisited the footage, what stood out was not a single devastating line, but the accumulation of restraint. Gabbard did not rush, did not gloat, and did not personalize beyond what the record demanded. Each response built on the last, creating a structure that could not be easily dismissed as partisan theater. Schiff's inability to adapt within that structure revealed more than any accusation could have. The contrast did the work on its own. In the end, the hearing did not resolve the questions it raised, and perhaps that was its most honest outcome. Democratic systems rarely offer clean endings, only clearer choices. What it did offer was a demonstration of how accountability can look when it is procedural rather than performative. It showed that truth does not always arrive as a revelation, but sometimes as a method applied consistently. And for viewers paying attention, that method may prove more enduring than any single verdict.